Thanks for the music. When Mark asked me to preach, I was kind of dickering with it, and he said, "You know, the jazz band's going to play that day." And I said, "Okay, I'll do it." Because when you guys play, it doesn't matter. We've already worshiped, so it doesn't matter what I say because of that. And then we have the new piece, the debut of Curtis's song, released on Friday for the first time. I don't know where they buy it, Curtis, but I think Spotify and all of the usual places. But insightful lyrics to Joseph, and thank you for all of that. And our UBC players, in which, again, we're trying to get into the mind of Joseph. And I'm going to try to do that too, get in the mind of Joseph and to get into our minds, because there's not a whole lot in the Gospels about Joseph, but the things coming to my mind is that somehow or another Joseph was able to hear God. And if Joseph was not able to hear God, and Mary was not able to hear God, could God come? And what about now, Advent, here, you and I? If we can't hear God, can God come? And how do we hear God? How do we perceive God? What is that all about? I think we can learn from Joseph, but there's really not a whole lot about Joseph in the Gospels. So the early church began to make up stuff. And so in the proto-Gospel of James, there's a slide for that I'm going to throw up on the screen if they'll do that. This was written in 150 AD, and they make up all kinds of things about Joseph. He has a hatchet that he throws away, and he has a rod that a dove comes out of, and he is an old man who takes a 12-year-old girl and has to kind of raise her. And so very different, fanciful stories about Joseph, because there's so little in the canonical Gospels, the early church began to make up things about Joseph to try to get into his mind. So he doesn't even appear in Mark's Gospel. In John's Gospel, he's mentioned as the father of Jesus, no virgin birth story. In Luke, it's pretty much all about Mary. But in Matthew's Gospel, Joseph shows up repeatedly, and there are two significant things stripped down to the bare essentials in the canonical Gospels. There are only two things about Joseph. One, he has these dreams. And number two is the character of Joseph. Remember that, because we're going to look at both. The dreams, the mind of Joseph, and his character. You see, if you read on into chapter 2, there are 4 different times that Joseph hears an angel in a sleeping state when he is dreaming. Anytime you hear things 4 times within the gospel in 2 chapters, it's like neon lights flashing. Say, pay attention to this. What are these dreams? Because they're unusual even by biblical standards, because most of the time dreams in every culture are usually symbolic. Upon waking, you know they're not real, and they have to have some kind of meaning to them, but the meaning has to be interpreted. Think of Joseph in the Old Testament, or Daniel, who made their way into the higher echelons of society with the kings by interpreting dreams. That's the usual biblical standard. The Joseph of our text had dreams. Upon waking, they were real, and they did not have to be interpreted. And he takes action based upon those 4 dreams to go ahead and stay with Mary, take them to Egypt, come back from Egypt, but go to Nazareth. 4 times there are dreams in these earlier texts. They were real. So what would have happened if he didn't listen and act upon the dreams? But he heard the dreams. Somehow God, through an angel, was speaking to Joseph in dreams. What are we to make of this? Some people, if you take a fundamentalist approach, it would basically say, just read the scripture literally. The Bible says it. Listen to it. It happened. Don't question. Believe it. There's an advantage to that. It teaches us faithfulness and obedience. Philosophical materialism would basically say, these are Santa Claus stories. Scientific evidence is you can't find it anywhere. And Bertrand Russell said, if his dreams are anything at all, they are delusions with benefits. But it's a delusional mind if he's having dreams at all. Pragmatism, a pragmatic approach, which is more what I prefer, would say the dreams were real, they were realer than real, and you can study it in such a way and understand it in order to continue to help humanity by learning from Joseph, listening to Joseph, and listening to God. This was the approach of William James, who in 1902 delivered the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and out of those lectures came a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, and he said, look, these experiences are real. People have them. Don't think in terms of doctrine and trying to fit them into doctrine, but the experiences like this, like Joseph had, they were realer than real. They're real. You need to learn from them. They carry a truth, and they can be best understood as different forms of human consciousness. Consciousness, think awareness, that somehow or another there's a different state between when you're dreaming awareness and when you're awaking awareness. And this is the quote you saw a moment ago from William James. Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. In this approach, Joseph's dreams are realer than real, but somehow in that sleeping state, the doors of perception are opened, and his mind is able to perceive something through the flimsiest of screens to another level of consciousness, and that is the place where God and the angels speak. Think of other texts about this flimsiest of screens. 1 Corinthians 13, we see through a what? A glass darkly, or a mirror dimly, the flimsiest of screens. Or think in terms of 2 Corinthians 3:18, where Paul is writing and he says, when we turn to the Lord, the veil is removed, and we are going to be changed from one degree of glory to another. The veil is parted. Or in Matthew 27, at the death of Jesus, what happens in the temple? The veil is parted. The flimsiest of screens become parted, and something from heaven comes to earth. Can we learn from Joseph? What's going on here? Can we hear God in such a way as that? Through different forms of consciousness other than our waking state? Fast forward to the 21st century, those who study these things have found that 30% of the population, between 30 and 35%, will admit to having spiritual experiences that are as profound as Joseph's. These spiritual experiences last generally 18.5 seconds. Don't tell me how they measured that. But you know, in your own dream state, it sounds like or feels like your dreams are going on forever and ever. They're probably only going on for about 10 seconds because the mind is working in another state of consciousness to reveal something in that other state of consciousness. Well, sometimes these experiences just come. Sometimes people, they seek them out. And people are usually hesitant to talk about them because people think they're out of their minds. And in some extent, we are in a different state of mind. But this list from the slide, if you do a statistical factor analysis of the people interviewed who've had these experiences, these are the types of experiences that people have. Numinous experiences, revelatory experiences, synchronicity experiences, mystical experiences, aesthetic experiences, paranormal experiences. Joseph's experience would fall into category 2 and 6. in which he had some kind of revelation and from some apparition of an angel that appeared to him in a dream. Now, either you have to write that off as Santa Claus, or you have to say something realer than real happened, and what modern studies are saying, it still happens. And how do you open your mind, and how do you learn from Joseph? If the canonical Gospels have stripped away the bare essentials of everything about Joseph and have told us, listen to his dreams and his character, maybe we ought to pay attention to that. And if we pay attention to that, in my opinion, you need to then kind of move into the Apostle Paul, who says, you need to think about what's going on in your mind. And if we're going to perceive God, we have to have an awareness of what's going on in our minds, in our waking states, and in altered forms of consciousness as well. The fact is that if you're going to perceive God or anything, it has to come through your mind. There is nothing that goes on in life that is real to you that doesn't go through your mind. The problem is we don't know what the mind is. It's bigger than your brain. It's in different parts of your body. It extends out beyond you. We do know that it's more than the brain, and that the mind can exist in different places at once and can access multiple states of consciousness. The most familiar, normal waking and dream state. The Apostle Paul said, by means of the Spirit, you can even access the mind of God. Think about that. Some scientists, in an imaginative way, would say God is the totality of all mind. I'm not sure that's scriptural, but that's what some people would say. But Paul would say, look, the only way you're going to connect with God is through your mind, and you've got to transform your mind. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Otherwise, you can't access God. And you need to set your mind on certain things. If you set your mind on the flesh, that's what you're going to get. You set your mind on the Spirit, that's what you're going to get. Set your mind on the Spirit. Do something with your mind. Or in the powerful passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, he says, spiritual people, different from natural or just psychological people, are open to revelation, to what eye has not seen, nor ear heard, which means open to something beyond what is in normal waking consciousness. And he says, beyond that, you can actually have the mind of Christ if you'll do that. That's incredible. I'm not sure we understand what we have, or even aware of what it takes to transform the mind so that you connect with the mind of Christ. Let's back up for just a moment. Even in normal waking consciousness, we have a limited perception of reality going through our minds at any given time. For instance, Bev and I will be taking a walk in the neighborhood, and she will say, did you notice the color of the door on that house that did not match the paint at all? And I will say, I noticed there was a house. Different perceptions of reality. Or I will say, did you notice the neighbor who walks his dog 6 times a day has a funny gait? He comes out of that side of the house all of the time. Did you? She'll say, no. Stop being nosy. Stop thinking about the neighbor's business, would you? Different reality. You can see the different perceptions that has given rise to the bread and butter of all therapy practices, marital therapy, because people see reality differently. We're perceiving the world, even in a normal state of waking consciousness, differently for some reason. I guarantee you the security guard out there is seeing things in the environment that you and I would not see, because he's trained. He's perceiving. His mind is perceiving elements of reality that you and I might not see. Right now in this room, I have no idea what you're perceiving. No, I wish I did. I wish you had a screen on the front of your face that said, I'm thinking this or I'm thinking that. I guess the Spirit can work that way, But when one is preaching, you have no idea what people are actually hearing. And then you think about the rest of the life. What are we hearing and what are we not hearing? What can we learn from Joseph? And if God comes to us through our minds in a perceiving way, how can we hear God if even in our normal waking state, we're not perceiving reality much at all? Robin Carhart Harris works in the Center for Psychiatry on the Hammersmith campus of Imperial College in West London and studies the neural correlates of alternative consciousness, states of alternative consciousness, recorded by Michael Pollan in his book, How to Change Your Mind. And he says that in the brain, if you study it and you do the brain imaging of people who move out of alternative states of consciousness, that we'll come back, we'll do this picture in a minute. He says there's a default mode network in the brain that acts like an orchestra conductor in your brain in the posterior cingulate cortex, if you want to go look for it. But that default mode network is actually like an orchestra conductor in the brain. And it's listening to things that are stored in memory, and it's filtering what's coming in through all of your senses. And the default mode network is like an orchestra conductor, making sure all of this makes some kind of sense, but only the measliest trickle of information is actually coming into the brain at any one time. And the brain becomes an efficient prediction-making machine in which it's going to predict what we're going to see even before we see it, based upon our memories and based upon what that default mode network, unique to you, is filtering from all of the sensory data that's coming into your mind. By late childhood, the default mode network has established what may be called grooves in the brain, in which just to get through the day, you have to have a brain that's going to predict what's going to happen, and it usually works very efficiently. This is the normal operation of the ego brain. It is reducing uncertainty so that we can get through the day, but it's filtering out a lot of reality. So for instance, you maybe have driven along a road before, and one time you had a near accident with a deer that jumped out of the woods. You drive along that same road, same time of day, going down, and you hit the brakes because all of a sudden you've seen something move and you know it's a deer, and the deer's not there. But your brain has predicted it based upon your memory and has filtered in some kind of reality as an efficient way of keeping you safe, but the deer's not there. Or think of two different people going to a party. And they walk in the room together, and one of the persons immediately says, "Did you see the way that person looked at me? I'm going to be out of here because I know this is going to be bad." And the other person says, "What person?" That person maybe had a stomach ache or something like that. There's nothing like that going on in this reality, but the grooves in the brain set by late childhood have predicted what's going to happen, trying to reduce uncertainty in your life, but in fact, filtering out an awful lot of reality. How much reality is being filtered out in our lives? And can you hear God? If you're filtering out the reality of God or angels or anything like that, in order to be able to see other realities, the research says you've got to either take offline or slow down the default mode network in your brain. Because otherwise, it's rigid grooves, it's working for you efficiently, but it's filtering out reality. Is this what happened to Joseph's brain? That somehow or another he had trained his default mode network to go offline so that he could see something that other people didn't see and hear something that other people didn't hear through the flimsiest of screens that exists between our reality and other realities that are around us all of the time. If we can't see much of reality that is available in our waking states, how are we going to see reality in some other kind of states? Well, the Apostle Paul says, listen, this is how it works with Christ. You have such a transformative experience of Christ that your ego dies. The ego brain, meaning the grooves in your brain, you jump out of the grooves. And by faith, and he says, don't have your mind yoked in slavery to the law. And the law is not just scriptural law, it's the law of your brain. Get out of the yoke of slavery by the experience of Christ so that it's no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. That's the way Paul talks about it theologically. Shift back to science for a minute. Alison Gopnik at Berkeley studies different states of consciousness, and in particular, the difference between the consciousness awareness of an adult and the conscious awareness of a child. Prior to the age of 5, the child will have more of a lantern approach where things are seen all around. Adult has a more focused, we're talking about those grooves again, focused attention, and some of it's necessary. It's not all bad. And so she said, if you want to take the default mode network offline, go have tea with a 4-year-old. They'll teach you something. Here are the images. Let's throw up that picture again of a magnetoencephalography. I can hardly say the word, about the different images between the mind. You see the image on the left? That's the normal state of waking consciousness. There's a strong line or two. The colors are about the same. The image on the right is the image like a child under the age of 5, in which there are many more paths in the brain going on. They're different colors. They're lighting up all over the place. Different from an adult who's gotten their mind into the grooves of predicting what's going to happen. This next slide will illustrate it from my world. I was with my 2-year-old granddaughter, and we were, quote unquote, working this puzzle. And even in that, you can tell that my default mode network was in place. And so we're working this puzzle, and we get to the rectangle, the top corner, the blue, and she picks it up, she puts it to her ear and says, "Hello?" I was thinking rectangles and blue, and she's thinking cell phone. The funny thing is, her father thinks she's not going to have a cell phone until she's 18. Good luck with that. Already at the age of 2. But you see, the brain was working in all different kinds of ways, and even playing a game. The adult brain, my brain, it was like, let's work the puzzle, and let's learn your colors and your shapes. You have to have that kind of brain. But there's a whole other reality that's just eliminated from all around you. She was becoming my teacher in all of this. You know, I think Jesus said something about this, didn't he? That you have to become like children in order to enter the kingdom of God? And is it that we have to get our brains offline so that we open up to other states of consciousness where the kingdom of God on earth lies? Because the kingdom of heaven that he talks about is not just something that is in an afterlife. This is something that we can perceive while here on earth through the flimsiest of screens. And a true Christ experience takes us. When we talk about being born again, the word is literally born from above. That you've got to get your mind in a different place, other states of reality, through which God comes and speaks to human beings. This is why Jesus said, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven. Because there's an awful lot of religious people who are doing one thing, and they're simply deepening the grooves and the ruts in your brain, as opposed to being people and a kind of religion that opens you up to an entirely different place of reality, where God speaks, like he did to Joseph 4 times in a dream. And but back to Alison Gopnik at Berkeley. Of the 2 brain images that I showed you on the right, the one was hypothesized to be like that of a child. It actually was the image of the brain of somebody who had ingested psilocybin. Psilocybin is the chemical component from the magic mushrooms used by indigenous populations in order to incur spiritual and religious experiences. And we don't do that in this church, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But in order to study the brain, you can't put a 5-year-old under a magnetoencephalograph or whatever it is. And you also, in 18.5 seconds, can't catch somebody who's having a religious experience. But if they ingest psilocybin, you can track the brain. And that's what the brain looks like. And it looks like the brain of a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old as well. But before you flip out, and what's happening is that with the psilocybin, the DMV, the default mode network, it goes offline. And your brain is open to all other kinds of realities. I don't think Joseph was getting high with a little help from his friends. To quote the Beatles, I don't think that was happening. And there's only one church that's in Brazil, started in Brazil in 1961, that encourages the use of these substances. But on the whole, the church says, no, we're not going to do that. Generally, because of the issue of control. The church believes that you don't control when God comes. And so you try to say, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to ingest this psilocybin, and I'm going to allow for God to come. And the church basically says, no, we don't do that. God will comes in other forms of reality, but you don't dictate when God comes. The other form of control is that the church found that it needed to control what was happening with indigenous people when they were on psilocybin. And so in their missionizing, they passed a law in 1625 that says you can't use these substances like psilocybin or peyote. They were, in essence, saying how you could see God and not see God, but also destroying an indigenous culture in the process. The other control is that you can't control what happens once you ingest psilocybin. And a lot of times there will be terror before you get any revelation. I know this because in 2001, when they opened the doors for research again at Johns Hopkins University in the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, they asked for pastors and pastoral counselors to volunteer, and I volunteered. Now you're saying, I know what's wrong with him. I finally know what's wrong with him. But I had one of those profound spiritual experiences that shaped the rest of my life, how I did therapy, how I see people. And you can't tell me that I didn't see the face of Christ during that time. But to get to that, I had to go through the worst terror, like a descent into hell, before you could get to the revelation. And I'd say to anybody, don't do this on your own. Because the most promising research now for help with depression, anxiety, and addiction is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. because it shakes the mind out of its ruts and in a very short time shifts you to something else. But the research isn't complete yet. Don't do it on your own. And it's got to be in a laboratory-controlled setting. But the other reason we don't trip out in church on some kind of chemicals is because there are other ways to take the default mode network offline that we do in church all the time, but we often don't think of it in that terms. These are some of the ways that you can take the default mode network offline and open yourself to other realities. They are in the spiritual practices of the church. Meditation, there's a slide for this if you guys want to put it up. Breathing exercises, fasting, sensory deprivation, including retreats like Jesus. Didn't he go to the wilderness? And isn't that where he met Satan? Resting in the scriptures, reading it. One of the greatest places to see something and hear something from God, almost another state of consciousness, is to be able to sit with the scriptures until God speaks. And it opens you to another level of consciousness. Worship, the synchronicity of hymn singing, speaking in tugs in some traditions, being caught up in the music and sometimes the rhythmic of preaching, the mystery of this is my body, this is my blood. Being caught up in the Spirit is the phrase that we will use, but you are actually opening your mind to a different state of consciousness and taking the default mode network offline. And you can see things and you can hear things that you would never see and hear in your normal state of waking consciousness. Don't we realize what we have? The power of what we have and our ability to see and hear and to move into other states of reality, as opposed to a form of religion that simply deepens the grooves in your brain. Because that form of religion, when it gets threatened in times of social change, will align itself with worldly power and always turns to violence, as opposed to the opening to other realities that always comes away with an overwhelming, ineffable sense of God's love and peace. Different ways of being religious. Which way are we going to be? Are we going to deepen the grooves in the brain, or are we going to open ourselves to other realities? And I will close with this, but I said it's not only Joseph's dreams, it's Joseph's character. You see, without character, you don't have a container for the dreams. And even with altered states of consciousness, you have to judge, is it God speaking or something else speaking? You have to test the spirits. What is this experience? We have to have a container. And is it a mental health crisis? Because there are lots of people who have schizophrenia who also hear God speaking. What is it? You have to have character that goes along for a container for any reality that's other than waking consciousness. And that kind of character, the kind of character that Joseph has, is he's a righteous and just man. Catching up the two sides of that word, righteousness without justice becomes self-righteousness, and justice without righteousness becomes individual rights without individual responsibility. Righteous, self-regulation or self-control. Without that, this would have been a case of domestic violence with Mary. That's what usually happens with the ego brain. Self-regulation, self-control, self-reflection. In this story, it's Joseph who does the pondering and the discerning. You have to be able to be self-reflective, humble and quiet, obedient, ego strength, but not ego defensiveness or ego demise. You have to have an ego, but it can't be rigid. But ultimately, finally, the gospel story is not about Joseph. The gospel story is about Jesus, Jesus the Christ, the God-man, who comes into earth, and in the one person, heaven and earth come together. But you see, that's what we're called to. If you're going to follow Jesus, then you have to become the person where heaven and earth come together. The Apostle Paul says, you're now the temple of God. You're the tabernacle. And in that tabernacle, the veil is torn, the flimsiest of screens. And we become people who can bring in our very bodies and minds the coming together of heaven and earth and all forms of consciousness. And its faith then becomes the assurance of things hoped for and the convictions of things not seen. But you've got to be aware of it, because if you're not aware that it's going on, it won't be in your reality. And there's lots of other people competing for your attention and your reality. And we've got our nose and our phones and everything else. That's just taking away our attention. But how do we, with these practices, develop a life where the heaven and earth come together? And in moments of awe and wonder, there is the parting of the flimsiest of screens. Or for me, the 2-year-old standing beside you, you plug in the Christmas lights, and she goes, wow, up high, an angel up high. And for a moment, the screen has parted, and wonder has descended, and God might even speak. May God come to you at Christmas in the wonder and the awe of Christmas. Amen.